Hey everyone, it's Jaime Alejandro here with the Arts Calling Podcast, the showcase of hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. I have a wonderful conversation lined up for you today, but first I'd like to do a quick shout out. I'd like to take a moment to highlight the First Draft Club. This is a podcast by Mary Adkins, who is an author and writing coach. She was a guest on Arts Calling recently, and I've been listening to quite a bit of the catalog, and she's had so many informative short-form episodes that I think would be beneficial for you to consider. It's a remarkable podcast to help you overcome resistance and write with more joy, clarity, and confidence. And so if you're working on a novel or memoir, you should give it a listen. Check out the link in the episode description and enjoy the First Draft Club with Mary Adkins. This time around, I am Arts Calling John Yamrus. In a career spanning more than 50 years as a working writer, John has published 35 books, including 29 volumes of poetry, 2 novels, 3 volumes of nonfiction, and a children's book. He has also had nearly 3,000 poems published in magazines and anthologies around the world. A number of his books and poems are taught in college and university courses. He is widely considered to be a master of minimalism and the neo-noir in modern poetry. His latest books are 24 Poems and Selected Poems, The Director's Cut. A volume of his selected poems was recently published in Albania, and 24 Poems is due out in translation later this year. It was such a pleasure to chat with John about so many years as a working writer, somebody who's been doing this for a very long time. I think there's great moments of insight and just a very light conversation, so I hope you enjoy. And so with that said, let's give John a call. Hello, is this John?
Okay, how's that?
That sounds wonderful. Hey, John, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. How's the weather over there in your neck of the woods?
Okay, let me put this on speaker. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. So how's it going over there in your neck of the woods?
It's cold. It's probably in the high 50s. We're closing our pool on Wednesday. Things suck on that end.
Oh, no. Well, I'm really excited to get to talk to you. You have a lot of history that I'm really eager to get to learn more about. But if we could kind of set the stage a little bit about your work and sort of how you find writing, could you share a couple of things about how you made your way into writing?
That's a perfect first question. I've been publishing for 53 years now. Apparently, I'm older than dirt. I've been publishing for 53 years. When I was starting out, like most aspiring writers, most aspiring artists, it's difficult to get your foot in the door. And I had a friend, my best friend Rick, and I, we were both aspiring writers at the time. And as such, we were finding it difficult to we'd write to publishers, and they'd say, well, where have you been published before? What awards have you won? And, of course, the answer was nowhere and nothing. So every weekend he and I would get together, and we'd finish off a really cheap bottle of pop-off vodka. I don't know if they even sell this stuff. It might have been outlawed after years. We'd finish a bottle of pop-off vodka, and I'd either walk him back to his house or he'd walk me back to my house. But one night had to be 2:00 in the morning, and we were weaving our way back down to his house. Now, I swear to God, this is a true story. We're walking back to his house, complaining as we always did about how we couldn't get published, hadn't won any awards. And he took the last sip of that bottle of pop-off vodka, looked up at the street sign, which happened to be the corner of Oliver and Wakefield Streets. Now, this is a true story. He looked up at the sign, which said Wakefield Street, and said, John, I hereby award you the Wakefield Prize. And he handed me the bottle of vodka. Took the bottle of vodka, and we went our separate ways. The next morning, I rode off to a fairly prestigious, well-known magazine out of Chicago at the time. And I said, I've recently been awarded the prestigious Wakefield Prize. Would you think about publishing some of my work? I sent off a whole batch of poems, and with that letter, a couple weeks later, I get I almost said email. I get a letter in the mail that said, "Dear John, I heard about you recently winning the Wakefield Prize. Congratulations! I'd very much like to publish your work." And that is how I lied my way into a 53-year career as a working writer.
Oh my
True
goodness.
Story.
So I just love this sort of, I hate to use the term like to date the story in some respects, but it does feel like something that could only happen 50 years ago, because of now you think of the obstacles that would come from that, which would be, oh, they would take 5 minutes to Google it or whatever. But I love the tenacity to just say, yeah, I'm going to fake it till I make it. And I'm just going to tell them my favorite narrative and see what happens. But hey, it seems to have worked out for you. And so what did you do after that? What was the following step that you took to feel like you were actually arriving as a poet?
Well, let me back up a bit. I've been publishing for 53 years. I think I've published 37 or 38 books, and I really feel uncomfortable calling myself a poet.
Mm.
The reason being, I see Walt Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe and Mayakovsky and those kind of people. They're poets. I'm still aspiring to that designation. So yeah, I'm not yet a poet. I'm just a work in progress. But back in the day when I was getting started, when I was in my young 20s, it was the height of the Mimeo revolution. Back then, anybody, if you're of a certain age, you remember when you were in school, you would get the test handed out, and they were done on spirit duplicators, which is an alcohol-based process.
Mm.
And we'd get our tests in school, and if you remember, we'd all pick them up and smell them with that fresh alcohol smell on them. And I got myself, must have cost me $100, a cheap spirit duplicator, and I started running off a duplicated issue of a magazine that I used to publish monthly. And anybody who had a spirit duplicator would publish a magazine, 300, 400 copies. And there became a community of writers and publishers, and that's how we all kind of got started. There were, that's where Bukowski cut his teeth. That's where people like Gerald Laughlin and all those others got started. And I, being just a few years younger than that crowd, also got started in that way. So the Mimeo revolution was where I got my feet wet.
Yeah. So whenabouts was this? Like, what if you could give me like a year just for frame of reference for folks who may be listening?
That was probably the early 70s.
Okay. Yeah. And so that seemed to be a thriving community. Was this something that was localized or something that you felt was happening nationally or internationally even?
At least my small participation in it was on a national basis. But when I say national basis, these small magazines, again, I said, had a few hundred copies. It was all little teeny niches of groups. A guy named D.A. Levy, he used to publish things on Mimeo, and there's just so many names, so many interesting people who got our feet wet and learned that you got to do the work. You have to do it every day. And sometimes it bothers me. Go ahead.
So do you recall what kind of stuff you were writing about at that time and what kind of things you were publishing, whatever your friends were writing about? What was the kind of climate of content that was being created there in terms of inspirations? What was guiding you at the time that made you want to write?
Well, guiding me at the time was every writer starts out imitating your heroes. So at that time, I was a carbon copy imitation of Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Walt Whitman. My stuff was very bardic. I wanted to write at that time. I wanted to write the great poem. And it took me a good 20 years to realize that was not the right path for me. Writing the great poem was not the right choice for me. My choice, the proper path for me, was learning how to and understanding how to illuminate those small moments in life. And like I said, it took me a good 20 years to figure that out. I had already had, I bet, 15 books published by that time. Really crappy books. Really bad books. Two bad novels.
Yeah.
Two novels that go ahead. This is fun.
No, this is great. Tell me about those specific failures. If you could recount one where because in the moment, I don't know that we know they're failures. I think that we think that they're the best that we can do with the time that we have, with the ability that we have, and the skill sets are still being acquired. So can you share with me, when you looked back to a specific novel or collection of poems that you had released in the first chunk of your career, what were the things that you were identifying as problems or issues that you said, oh, this is clearly a problem, or I can't believe I was doing that at the time, just so that we can look at those breakthroughs and see what you learned from them?
Well, they're all part of that natural progression of learning and growing and gaining your own voice. When I talk to kids in classes and writing groups, I tell them that that's the main thing an aspiring writer has to do. Whether you're writing poetry or whether you're writing prose or even whether you're making music. When you listen to Carlos Santana, you know that's Carlos Santana, or that's Miles Davis. When you're reading Stephen King, that's Stephen King, because he has a recognizable style and voice. And that's something I encourage every aspiring writer or musician to attain to, finding out what's comfortable and real and true for you.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up, because speaking of Carlos Santana, I was listening. We went for a drive because we've been cooped up with COVID in the last week and a half, and we got the family in the car, and one of my playlists has the Woodstock Soul Sacrifice session, where it was like 12 minutes of heaven, and just like this weird, almost religious experience, right, of Santana. But Santana, when he was, in his early 20s, or I don't even know how old he was quite young, to the Santana of now, there are some imprints of his voice that haven't changed, that are very singular, very unique to him. And I think if we could talk about the things that you identified about yourself that were kind of the way into poetry, because I think that that's another way to see it, right? We can talk about all of our failures. We can talk about the things that we did that weren't very smart when we were young as artists, but what were the things that intuitively worked for you at that age that still work for you? Because those are little pieces that are identifiers of your own voice. So what were those things for you?
I can tell you exactly. I could tell you specifically and precisely that aha moment for me. Let me back up a little bit. For me, poetry is, almost by definition, saying as much as you can in as few words as possible. And like I said, in my early days, I used to have, I like most aspiring writers, I'd write and talk and talk and talk. I fell in love with the sound of my own voice, and that was my mistake. My aha moment, where the clouds kind of seemed to part for me, it's a good 20 years ago, maybe more, when I wrote a poem that was, and this is imprinted in my brain. I think it was only 17 words, and I could recite that poem to you, my aha moment poem. It went like this. This is the poem. Write a poem. Write a poem about that, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed, smiling. Now, years ago, before that moment, I would have continued writing and talking and describing exactly what that moment was. But for some reason, the stars just were in the right space for me. I looked at what I had wrote, and I realized right then and there that what I had said and what the reader was going to read, more importantly, what the reader was going to read was more interesting, more descriptive than anything I could write. So once I said, write a poem about that, she said, I gave up the poem and put it in the hands and imagination of the reader. And once I recognized that, once I realized that the reader is a whole part of this nifty little dance we do as artists, the clouds parted and my job became a whole lot easier from then on. And it's been clear sailing ever since.
It was almost like you needed to have that realization that writing is an act of instigation rather than a complete thing. It's just getting the question out there. And I do feel that way because that's my philosophy with theater. I write plays, and it needs to be completed by the second person, the reader, the audience, whoever that person who is receiving that experience. But it's such a key bit of wisdom to have so early on, and it's amazing that you found that so early on. So how do you go about building the rest of that catalog? What kind of battles did you have during these 40 years, 50 years of creating work that stick out in your mind?
Oh, I could tell you exactly. The battle is a battle with consistency and professionalism. I always run into writers who, I'll say, what are you doing now? Oh, I'm just waiting for inspiration. And that's a load of crap as far as I'm concerned.
So you don't believe in that. You don't believe in the writer's block thing. You feel that the professionalism will win out by having just total discipline day in and day out.
Yes, good work habits. Doing it day in and day out. Do it every single day. I always looked at myself as being a kind of a lunch pail type of guy. I do the job. I come down here. My office, if you want to call it that, is in my basement, my desk. And I come down here every day. I try to do something to further my writing every day. And that's important. Those guys who say they're waiting for inspiration, or those people who talk about saying, oh, man, I sent something out last week and it got rejected. For me, rejection is just put in the road to weed out the unwilling. I've always wanted to be willing.
Yeah.
That's the way I've looked at it.
Yeah. So let's talk about life for a minute, because it's something that is so in my mind 100% of the time in terms of the many aspects of our daily living that include not writing, such as your day job, such as family, such as building a career or some kind of stability outside of the arts. I feel that's incredibly important to address, and I'm hoping that you might indulge me in sharing a bit about how you've allowed your writing to thrive in whatever environment you may be. So could you share a little bit about how you have found stability to continue? Because I know that that's another barrier outside of the practical nuts and bolts of, say, writer's block or whatever, but like some people just can't afford to eat because they're too focused on their writing. So is there a middle ground, or what has worked for you over the years in terms of building a sustainable way to live that supports writing?
Well, nothing supports writing unless you're very, very, very lucky. Like Bukowski, that was lightning in a bottle.
Sure.
The guy caught it, and he recognized what his audience wanted, and he gave it to them. And he was very good at what he did. He was perfect at what he did. The balance is, again, getting back to discipline. And even if you only have 10 minutes a day to do your art, if you want to call it an art, you have to discipline yourself to do it. And that was always the case for me. In my working life, now I'm 72 now, almost at 73. I'm 72 now, so I'm officially retired, and I had been retired for quite some time. There reached a point when I lost my last job. I was in my late 50s, and someone, Todd Moore, a writer, Todd Moore, if you don't know him, Google him and look him up, Moore with an E on the end. He told me maybe the universe is trying to tell you that it's time to just write full time, and he was right, But finding that balance between making a living, having a life, and facing the world and all that comes with it, that's a challenge for anybody. It's never going to be easy.
Absolutely. And I subscribe to that idea. I mean, we have to be realistic about it because not everyone has the silver spoon to begin with, right? And so we have to be honest with ourselves about what we can handle in the moment or what we can actually achieve. And then from that, you start building and you start getting more, you start to acquire more tools that allow you to go further and further. And eventually you do get to that place of self, I guess, actualization through your art or whatever you want to call it. But did your retirement bring about more? Like, what did you feel happen when you got into that retirement situation?
It scared me. I was always afraid that, if I was doing this full time, would things change? Would my writing change? Would my approach to the whole thing change? Would having the luxury of being able to do it anytime I wanted, anywhere I wanted, would that change things for me? And it only made it better. And that's the weird thing. It made it so much easier.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to explain it other than that. And
yeah, and that makes complete sense.
I've got 2 new books coming out. A new book of poems that'll be out in November, called People and Other Bad Ideas. And I also have, I published a few years ago 2, we'll call them memoirs, but really they're basically poems with a thyroid condition.
That's another good title, and just keep that one in mind.
I will. In any case, they were just looking back at what it was like for me growing up in the late 1950s in growing up less than wealthy in a coal mining community, being an artsy kind of kid.
Yeah.
And those 2 books came out, and because of COVID, a lot of small businesses went out of print. They went out of business, and those 2 books were part of the fallout from COVID, and they went out of print. And recently, I had a book released in Europe in translation, and we did a book release by Zoom, and for some reason that got me a lot of attention. And part of the fallout from that was a publisher, 2 publishers actually, contacted me about bringing out more stuff. And my idea, to make a long story short, was to bring these 2 memoirs back into print and release them in 1 volume. The 2 memoirs are now going to be called The Street, and they'll be out in November. So I got 2 new books coming out in November.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. So if you like, we can talk about 24 poems for just a little bit, and then we can continue on talking about The Street if you like. But I'm curious about 24 poems because it is your latest book of poems, and I think that it might signal, I don't know, I guess maybe you could give me the overview of what this collection is about, or where it began, if you could.
Okay, let me back up one step behind that. Previous to that, the book immediately before that was called Selected Poems. My then publisher, Concrete Mist Press, he wanted to bring out a 550-page, that was the limit of his printing capabilities. He wanted to bring out a 550-page retrospective of my poetry. And I told him he was nuts. He was going to lose his shirt, because nobody would spend the kind of money that it would cost to buy a 550-page book of poetry, especially my crappy poetry. So we fought over it we fought over it for 2 months. And I went out, I got him to cut the book down from 550 pages to 384. He published the book, and it sold. It became his best-selling title. So then he came back to me and he said, John, I want to release this book the way it was originally intended, 550 pages. I told him he was even crazier than he was at the first time, because we had already sold as many as we were going to, and he was going to really lose a lot of money. Well, we fought again, and I told him he was crazy, but I let him bring out 542-page edition of my selected poems, which we called Selected Poems, the Director's Cut. And to both of our surprise, so you can appreciate that title, and to both of our surprises, Selected Poems, the Director's Cut came out and hit #1 in poetry, #1 on Amazon for like an hour and a half. But I took a screenshot of that being #1 on Amazon. And after that book came out, now that book was $35, a very expensive thing, which made it prohibitive for young readers, for students and people like that. So I wanted my next book to be slim, affordable, cheap. So that's how 24 Poems came into being. And that book came out, and it was only $14, and it did and is doing very well. So I'm proud of that book. I'm proud of all my books.
Yeah. So what is the content of 24 Poems? Can you share a bit about what is it that you're trying to share in 24 Poems?
I when I sit down to have a book, there's never a real point I'm trying to make. It's just a snapshot of whatever I'm doing at that time. Individually, poems, the way I look at them, are snapshots. Imagine yourself in a moving train or a car or whatever, and you're looking out the window. And the poem is what you see at that given second when you look out that window. But everything else around that window is the reader's imagination. So poems are just snapshots of a moment in time. And again, my poems are snapshots. Let me read something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Real short one. She said, touch spit to me and I sizzle. That's way too hot, he said. Damn it, half the tequila. That's just a snapshot. You know, the poems are very short. Or again, this one, only a page and a half. I'm a sucker for black and white movies and salads made with oil and vinegar and real crunchy garlic bread. I have a high tolerance for pain except for needles and hangnails. I love dogs, hate cats, and slam the door on Jehovah's Witnesses. I like W.C. Fields, Groucho Marx, and fart jokes, and anything that has to do with World War II. I've had 5 great loves in my life. 4 were dogs, and the 5th is upstairs laying on the couch, half asleep, watching Dateline. Again, I just want my poems to be little snapshots of my life, which is not exceptional, which is just like anybody else's life. And if anything, that's the exceptional part of my poetry, understanding that it's not exceptional. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, because I think that you arrive at a moment where you're not creating artifice. You're not feeling uncomfortable with your voice and what you have to say. And there's something about complete honesty, bravery, and commitment to who you are that takes some time to master. It's not something that is organic to most people. And I think that is an achievement. In my opinion, there's probably been about 15 years of my writing that feels like emulation, right? And now I'm arriving at a place that feels so genuine to me that I'm like, yes, I've written like handfuls and handfuls of plays, but these ones that I'm writing this year or in the last while are the ones that feel the most true to who I am. And what a gift that is. That is just a wonderful place to be. So it's incredibly wonderful to see and hear. So,
and it's a great feeling, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's truth. It's truth and honesty with oneself and self-love in some ways. I mean, it really is just accepting this is who I am and what I have to share. I got a couple of questions here to be mindful of your time, but I wanted to ask you, what is on the horizon here moving forward for you? You are incredibly prolific. You're doing so much, but I'm curious how you're organizing your priorities in the next year or so.
There's no organization. It's kind of haphazard. Everything is, on the fly. But again, the organization lies in doing it every day. So the organization lies in the commitment to a work ethic. That's something I can't stress hard enough to aspiring writers. You just got to be you got to be consistent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if there are any other things that you'd like to share to, say, somebody who's just starting on their creative journey, I feel like I want to put a bit more emphasis on that part of the podcast because I think that you have so much history doing this that you've picked up things that work for you, and I'm curious if you could share a few things that have indeed been tried and true for you in terms of the specifics of your routine. And what does that look like? What is a win for you? How do you catalog those things? And what keeps you going in the moment when the writing just isn't ideal?
Okay. When something doesn't work for me, and that's most of the time, and you got to learn that, you got to accept that. I throw it out. I've never been one of those kind of writers who saves a whole stack of works in progress. If a poem doesn't work for me, immediately or almost immediately, I throw it out. Now, that comes, and you could appreciate this, that comes with doing the work over time and getting that intellectual muscle memory that when you're going good, Mm-hmm. So by the time something hits the paper, it's already almost complete in my head. But that only comes through time. It's like, a baseball player doesn't think, I've got to take a step to my left and lead with my right foot. He doesn't think about that. That's just a natural process from having done it 1,000 times over and over again. Same thing with the poetry. That facility only comes from coming down here every morning and trying it 1,000 times, 1,000 days.
Yeah. So it's the consistency. You come back to that willingness, that determination to share, even on the days when you don't feel like it then.
Absolutely. I come down here and I do something, and most times it's just crap, and I understand that. But the good thing for me was understanding that those bad days are part of the process. You don't get those good days without running through a whole lot of bad days. Mm-hmm. Just part of the process.
Yeah. So if I may ask, do you still feel that that total feeling of excitement when you've completed a manuscript? When do you know it's done? And let's say 24 poems, for example. when you finished that manuscript, or you had a conversation with your editor and it was a done deal, what is it feeling? Has it eroded that pleasure of completing something?
It never gets old. And I would have thought it would. At 72, I get just as excited about having a book accepted, having some magazine write and say that they're taking some of my stuff. That joy never gets old. And I'm fortunate and I'm happy and I'm grateful because of that. When I'm putting together a book, especially a book of poems, I understand that it's got to have a narrative to it, an ebb and a flow of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's part of the job for me. We were talking about that whole thing of acceptance and appreciating the little moments. Let me read another poem to you, if I may. It goes, "Somebody take my picture, quick. Right now, Kathy's upstairs baking something. I don't know what it is, but the recipe calls for whiskey. She asked me to get it for her, so I dug a bottle of Jack Daniels out of the cabinet. It's right now sitting on top of this desk, right here in front of me, along with my reading glasses and some poems I just finished. And, it'd make a great picture, the hard-drinking and harder-living poet, knocking off the poems and the JD with equal skill. A really great picture. Take it. Take it now. Take it now and I'll sign it for you. Take it now and I'll give you $20 to go away. Take it now before you go upstairs and take that other picture. You know the one. Me in an apron taking cookies out of the oven."
It's beautiful. It's wonderful stuff there. So, John, I want to just take a minute to ask you one last question. This has been a phenomenal time, and I do hope that we get to chat down the road. I know that you have a lot of projects coming down, so hopefully in the coming months, we'll get together to have a round two. But lastly, because this has been so fruitful in terms of longevity and having that kind of long-term mentality, and seeing you continue is I think the most inspiring thing personally to me. I love hearing these stories so much that I wonder if you could just indulge me for a moment and share a couple of final thoughts for folks who are just getting started on that creative journey, whether they're writing fiction or poetry, whatever it is that they want to share. Could you let them know some things for the long journey, for the long haul?
Boy, you have to understand that things change. You change as an artist. Again, I'm sure you can appreciate this, and you're not going to be the same person or artist that you were. Miles Davis, the perfect example. He changed every time in his career, and he did things differently, and he did it to keep it interesting for himself. And I try to do that. I try to change. I try to keep things fresh and new. I'm always trying to discover something new about myself and my surroundings. And as young writers, you have to do that. And you always start out by finding people that you like, that you appreciate, that you look up to. For me, it was, again, as a writer, I looked up to musicians who taught me more about writing than other writers did. Most importantly, Miles Davis. Again, I always talk about Miles. What I learned from listening to him was that less is more, that the silence on the page or in a musical sense, the silence is just as important as the sound. And that was something that was hard and took a long time for me to understand. And if I could pass that on to young writers, they can learn that silence, all the rest of the white parts of their page is very important. That's something I'd like to pass on.
And I think that's a beautiful, remarkable, insightful note to end on. So John, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been such a pleasure. And I want to thank you for this determination and for this honesty to embrace oneself and one's perspective and share it with the world. And doing that over the long haul, as I said, is just such a gift. So thank you again for your time. And I know we just scratched the surface, but hopefully we'll get a chance once again to catch up. And maybe you can let me know what else you're up to. And maybe we can talk about music too.
I'd love to do that. I've got so many musicians I'd love to talk about. And when those 2 new books are out, maybe we can do this dance again. I'd really appreciate it.
Hey, that sounds like a plan, John. Thanks again for bearing with me as we try to put everything together. But I will be in touch real soon on the internet, and I will have an episode for you real soon. So you take care, and I will be in touch real soon.
Thanks, man.
All right. You take care.
Okay, bye. Thank you.